response.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I begin by acknowledging that I speak to you today virtually from the traditional territory of the WSANEC Nation. I raise my hands to you in the language of the traditional peoples of this land, hych'ka, siem. I'm speaking today at report stage on Bill C-19. I can't help but reflect on the debate we just had on the application of time allocation to this bill. I'd just like to point out to this House and put it on the record. Of course, I voted no to ending debate in the fashion that has become entirely too routine under this government and the government before it. It will, having been used routinely under the administration of Stephen Harper and now under the current government, it's unlikely to ever return to what it was before 2011, which is to say that this House will suffer a permanent loss of normal democratic debate under our standing orders for bill after bill after bill. In this case, Bill C-19 was tabled for first reading following the April 7th budget. It was tabled for first reading April 28th. That is not that long ago in the life of this Parliament. This is not like Bill C-8, which was, of course, the fall economic statement bill, which was tabled at the end of in December 2021 and only passed within the last few weeks in this place. Bill C-19 has been dealt with quickly, sharply, went to committee for reports, and is already, and this is an important point that I wish to make, Madam Speaker, Bill C-19 is already in pre-study before the Finance Committee in the other place. So the question of delay in handling this bill, allowing for proper debate at this stage, is rather wrong-footed by the fact that when we finish with it, which would be very soon in any case, despite, I agree, obstructive activities by the official opposition, there was ample time to get this bill properly debated at report stage and third reading and sent to the other place where pre-study has already begun. It is a significant bill. Madam Speaker, for those who may be observing our deliberations today, let me just point out that this bill is hundreds of pages. It is an omnibus bill. It's not an illegitimate omnibus bill. It deals actually with all the measures that were flagged in budget 2022 on April 7th. So it's not one that has extraneous measures crammed into it, which would make it an illegitimate omnibus bill. But this legislation is lengthy, 32 separate divisions, hundreds of pages, over 502 sections. I can't propose for a second to think that I can comment on all of them, even those with which I agree. But the scope is enormous. We deal with everything in this legislation, from safe drinking water on First Nations communities, which of course nobody would want to have anything but speed applied, to something called the Lunar Gateway and criminal code offenses related to an agreement we have with the United States for events which may take place on the moon, as I understand it, to changes in the criminal code, which raised some civil liberties concerns about changing the civil, this is in Division 21, to extend up to 2 years in jail towards people who are, and there's no defense for it, it's appalling, but denying the Holocaust, but will now have a criminal sanction of up to 2 years in jail. It's, I think, worth considering that a bill of this scope, covering so many different measures, including ones I support, like application of Magnitsky sanctions, and being able to act to further sanction Vladimir Putin's cronies in order to apply pressure so that we get to peace talks as quickly as possible in the horrific and illegal war that's now occurring in Ukraine. But we have a lot in this bill to discuss, and I put it to you, Madam Speaker, that the application of time allocation, as just occurred in this place, is inappropriate. Now, the things that I would like to discuss in more detail, of course, it would be, I agree with my colleague from the block who just spoke ahead of me. The employment insurance regime needs a lot more review. We have some measures in this bill that are good, but we haven't begun to get to the work that needs to be done to ensure that people, particularly those in regions of the country where it's harder to find employment, particularly people in seasonal industries where their employer makes the decision to lay them off seasonally and bring them back. Workers in those categories need to know that they can count on their insurance employment benefits, what we used to call unemployment insurance. It's past since time that we do a full review to make sure that unemployment insurance, employment insurance as it's now known, is available to Canadians who have paid into it and who need it. And I wanted to turn some attention in the time I have today, and I do thank Liberal Party allocation for speeches to allow me to speak to this bill. But I want to talk about the luxury tax. I have come to the conclusion, somewhat reluctantly, Madam Speaker, because I initially liked the sounds of a luxury tax. It sounds like we're striking for equity and fairness and against the notion that there's a 1% and then there's the 99% who are, relatively speaking, less represented, who don't use the resources to the same extent, obviously, as the 1%. But I've come to the conclusion the luxury tax is more about pandering and public relations than about really dealing with income inequality in this country. This luxury tax doesn't deal with income inequality. And what the luxury tax does, Madam Speaker, is apply a tax on any car or aircraft that costs more than $100,000 or on boats that cost more than $250,000, an additional tax to the cost of the sale, buying that luxury item at the point of sale. In reflecting on this and looking at the work the Parliamentary Budget Office has done, if you're looking at the luxury tax, you find that it will bring in $170 million in 2024-25. Now, $170 million is a lot of money, but in the context of federal budget, it's sort of spilt cornflakes at your morning breakfast table. It's not bringing in substantial money. It will take a lot of Finance Canada time and application and point of sale. It will add to a lot of people's transactional costs to even establish this tax. But what PBO did find is that while it will bring in to the Government of Canada an additional $170 million, it will reduce the sales in those categories by $600 million. I don't think it adds up that applying this tax is worth the financial cost to the Government of Canada and the economy of Canada in losing the $600 million in sales, particularly in the case of boats and airplanes, and if we had them luxury cars made in Canada, that actually provide Canadian jobs, a positive impact to the Canadian economy and the communities where those luxury items are made. Far more important would be to adjust the personal income tax rate. At this point in Canada, once you're making over $216,511, the corporate tax rate the personal income tax rate is the same. It's 33%. That's our highest tax bracket. We certainly would do more to address income inequality were we to create a higher personal income tax bracket for people making, say, over $500,000 a year. I remind colleagues in this place that when the United States experienced its highest levels of economic growth and economic activity post-war, its highest personal income tax bracket was well over 90%. We should also be looking very, very immediately at excess corporate profits. A tax on excess corporate profits, the PBO has found, could bring in $7.9 billion a year. I contrast that with this so-called luxury tax, $170 million into our fiscal resources versus a tax on excess corporate profits would bring in just under $8 billion. We shouldn't be chasing the spilt cornflakes. We should be going after where the 1% hides their wealth, where the 1% earns so much more than the average working Canadian who has to hold down several jobs to be able to cover rent and food. And with those final thoughts, Madam Speaker, I close my remarks on C19.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm a bit surprised that the former leader of the Green Party would not support the principles of a luxury tax for two reasons. Number one, there is financial inequality in the country. We know that. It's around the world. And it might be somewhat small, but it's significant. $150 million in additional revenue is a significant amount. Now, if you follow through the logic that the member is espousing, one would ultimately be able to say that you should reduce consumption taxes in order to somehow see more production and give the brake on your tax points. I would tend to disagree with that logic, believing that a consumption tax is in fact a very effective way at ensuring, especially if you have rebates, that there's a fair sense of income equality. So I'm wondering if she might want to just reflect in terms of why it is she would oppose a luxury tax when I suspect a vast majority of Canadians would support that.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Yes, I'm sure, Madam Speaker, and thanks, Parliamentary Secretary, that in devising this luxury tax, the current government and its political leadership were looking to something that they knew most Canadians would support, the idea of a luxury tax. What I'm saying is the way it's constructed here, it is merely pandering to the idea that this government is tackling income inequality without actually doing it. I think it's really critical when we talk about, as the Parliamentary Secretary just did, that $170 million is a lot of money, not compared to the billions and billions that this government continues to insist we waste on the climate-killing Trans Mountain Pipeline. There are places where we should stop spending money, and supporting fossil fuels is an urgent cancellation. We have to urgently cancel fossil fuel subsidies instead of pretending we're actually dealing with income inequality through a luxury tax.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you. And this member, which is surprising given her relative youth, has perhaps one of the most experience in the entire Parliament. And I'm wondering, given that experience, would she agree with me that it's oftentimes in lengthy debates that actually legislation gets improved, that we find issues and that we make laws better for Canadians?
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I'm deeply indebted to the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, for suggesting I have relative youth. I turned 68 this week, and I find his comments absolutely charming. However, I will say that he's right. The purpose of the Parliament of Canada is to study and debate respectfully and with a civil collaborative effort to improve legislation. It is the case that I sympathize with the Liberal House management that most legislation is being needlessly obstructed by the official opposition. But in this, the member is absolutely correct. The point of debate is to improve legislation.
Questions and comments? The
Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Colleague, one of the things the budget does have in it is EV vehicle incentives extensions, $5,000 per vehicle. And my concern, though, is the United States actually has 7,500. So we're actually out of sync with the United States in that type of an incentive. And it's also at a time when we actually had the Liberals originally leave Canadian vehicles off the list. So I'm wondering if she has any thoughts about that. We want to see that increase, so we actually do what we normally do in the auto industry, is actually merge the standards and harmonization closer together, because right now Joe Biden is actually providing more of an incentive to buy Canadian vehicles than it is actually our own Prime Minister. And what I'd rather see is also an opening for used vehicles for battery and lower entries into the market, so more people can actually access this based upon income.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands has 50 seconds to respond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That's ample. I want to thank the member for Windsor West. He's absolutely right. We are not doing enough to promote electric vehicles. One of the things we should do is regulate to ensure that by a year not too far in the future, the purchase of internal combustion engine vehicles become illegal, and we move sharply to electric vehicles, and we provide more supports to Canadians who want to buy them. But the biggest gap in this area in the federal budget 2022 is the absence of a national goal for a fully integrated electricity grid between Manitoba and Ontario, between Quebec and the Maritimes. We lack the ability to move renewable energy across borders.